I recently saw a clip from a quiet London suburb, just milk bottles on doorsteps in a gray English sky, where two police officers were arresting a man in his pajamas. His crime wasn't theft or violence. He had simply liked a social media post that the state labeled grossly offensive. I thought back to a conversation I had with a British journalist who described this new reality with a chilling, detached calm. He told me that in the UK, freedom of speech is no longer an inherent right. It's a conditional privilege. He spoke of ordinary families scrubbing their private WhatsApp chats, terrified that one stray meme or a joke about government policy could lead to a criminal record. He seemed resigned to it, as if the death of individual expression was simply the necessary price for a civilized society. But then the atmosphere shifted. When I asked him why masked radicals openly calling for violence in the streets of London weren't facing those same arrests, his expression changed instantly. He went quiet, then gave a weary shrug. "That's different," he said.
That's community cohesion.
Yeah.
That moment, the sudden pivot from the iron-fisted censorship of a lone citizen to the total permissiveness toward a violent mob, reveals the core of Europe's soft totalitarianism. It is the rise of two-tier policing, where the law is no longer a neutral shield, but a weapon used to enforce an ideological orthodoxy. Europe is currently a laboratory for thought control, and as this model begins to find fans in American politics, we have to ask ourselves, how long until that 3 a.m. knock reaches our doors?
It is a striking contrast, isn't it? And it gets right to the heart of what happens when the rule of law becomes, well, fundamentally unbalanced.
Unbalanced is the word.
Right. When the state starts picking and choosing which types of disorder or, which forms of dissent are acceptable, the very definition of a right like free expression, it just mutates. It becomes a privilege.
A privilege granted only if you have the right opinions.
Exactly. A privilege granted upon good behavior or really ideological alignment.
That's right. And that's our mission in this deep dive. We want to explain to you, the listener, how this soft totalitarian model is actually being operationalized. We see it happening across three critical spheres.
It's all about the systemic nature of it.
Yes, the systemic nature of this ideological enforcement and the erosion of what we think of as inherent rights. So first we'll look at enforcement on the streets with physical policing and how public narratives get manipulated.
And the digital space.
Then we'll move into the global digital space.
Yeah.
We'll examine these new technocratic laws designed to, well, export European thought control.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we'll analyze the highest legal institutions of the European Union, which are being retooled to enforce a very specific singular set of EU values.
We're going to unpack the mechanisms.
We are. We're going to unpack the specific mechanisms used to enforce this ideological orthodoxy.
And that central theme is how this conditional privilege structure really works. It's a highly sophisticated system, and it shows a fundamental shift away from neutral governance, where the law is supposed to be blind,
right,
to a system of targeted ideological enforcement across physical, digital, and legal domains, where the law actively chooses its targets.
Okay, so let's unpack this starting on the street level.
Yeah.
We're focusing on the systemic undermining of the social contract. And the concept we keep hearing thrown around is two-tier policing. We hear this term from figures like Elon Musk or, leaders of certain populist movements in the UK. They're arguing that police forces are exhibiting an unfair, politically motivated bias.
Well, the claim is very specific, and it's designed to be provocative, right? It alleges that law enforcement is overly lenient toward groups they identify as progressive or associated with racial minorities. So think of certain factions within the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right, there's the one side of it.
And then on the other side, that they're simultaneously targeting and actively victimizing predominantly white, often far-right, groups who are protesting against, say, migration or government policy.
This narrative that the conservative protester is the one who's uniquely victimized. Yeah. It feels like a very strategic way to shift the entire debate.
It's more than just a debate shift. It's a calculated communication strategy that we identify as reverse victimization.
Reverse victimization.
Exactly. This approach is designed to appropriate the narrative of victimhood. It positions demographics like white men as the current victims of state violence and police brutality.
And why is that strategy so effective politically? What makes it stick?
It's extremely effective because it attempts to neutralize, or really to completely obfuscate, the whole conversation around the long-standing, very well-documented systemic racial bias that already exists within police and state institutions.
So it's a diversion.
It is. If you can convince a segment of the public that they are the real victims of police overreach, you successfully divert attention from the actual historical victims of systemic inequality.
It seemed to leverage the public consciousness that was raised during events like the global Black Lives Matter uprisings. People gained a new, really intense awareness of how the criminal legal system can operate as a tool of oppression.
Precisely. The far right is now appropriating this hard-won knowledge, the public's understanding of systemic bias, and they're twisting it to position their own members as the new primary targets of state oppression.
And the goal is simple.
The underlying goal is very simple. If the public focuses on the perceived oppression of white protesters, they are far less likely to focus on the actual documented oppression of racial minorities.
Okay, but let's talk about the documented reality of bias. Is the core claim that the far right is uniquely targeted, is that actually accurate when you hold it up to the evidence?
The evidence, it decisively shows that the far right claim is an inversion of the truth. While they perceive a two-tier system where they are unfairly victimized, the reality remains that police inequality disproportionately targets women, queer people, and, most crushingly, racially minoritized groups.
And this isn't just anecdotal.
Oh no, this is not a matter of anecdotal evidence. It's documented across multiple metrics.
So where does this documented bias show up most clearly? I mean, how does police inequality actually manifest in the day-to-day enforcement environment?
It appears starkly in several measurable areas. First, the use of force. Who is subjected to higher levels of physical restraint or violence? Second, the disproportionate application of stop and search procedures, which often target specific communities, regardless of whether they've committed an offense.
Right, just based on who they are, where they live.
And third, the type of weapons used. We see disproportionate deployment of tools like tasers against specific demographic groups. This threat of police violence, this differential policing, it cuts along very disturbing lines of race and class.
You mentioned a very specific and frankly disturbing statistic concerning the ultimate cost of this bias.
Yes, the data is sobering. Analysis showed that 23% of total deaths that occurred in or following police custody between 2015 and 2020.
23%.
23%. That's 20 out of 86 documented deaths during that relatively short period were people of Black and minority ethnic background.
Wow.
That statistic alone really demolishes the argument that police enforcement is neutral or that predominantly white groups are the unique victims of institutional police violence. It highlights a fundamental systemic failure.
It's a stark reminder that the social contract is severely frayed for certain communities. So moving on from targeted demographics, the other major tactic used to enforce this ideological uniformity is the strategic blurring of protest and riot.
This conflation is a deliberate political tactic. It's used to discredit social justice movements and, really, civil disobedience in general. For the rule of law to function, there has to be a critical distinction between a legitimate protest, which is an exercise of free expression, even if it's disruptive, and a destructive riot.
So if you blur that distinction, what's the political utility of that confusion? Why do it?
By systematically labeling legitimate actions of protests, things like occupying a square or civil disobedience to block a highway as rioting, the state and certain media factions create a false equivalence.
So they might label, say, BLM participants as rioters.
Exactly. And that then politically paves the way for far-right agitators to label themselves as mere protesters, and then they can claim they're victims of political suppression when law enforcement takes action against them.
I want to focus on that false equivalence, because that seems to be the poison pill here, as you called it before. What kind of actions are being equated, and why is that so dangerous?
The danger is the moral and legal collapsing of categories. We are seeing acts of peaceful, albeit disruptive, civil disobedience, say, defacing a statue or delaying traffic, being categorized as morally or legally equivalent to truly destructive or violent acts, such as setting fire to a building full of people or beating up a passerby because he happens to be Black.
It's a completely different scale of action.
Right. And when the former, a symbolic act of protest, is aggressively labeled as violence, it diminishes the severity and the uniqueness of the latter, which is true physical violence and criminal destruction.
And if the state treats a student sitting in a road and a violent aggressor as essentially the same, doesn't that grant a kind of implicit moral legitimacy to the most extreme elements?
It absolutely does. The outcome is the erosion of the social contract and the validation of extreme viewpoints. When a government insists on treating all forms of public disorder with the same level of full force of the law, regardless of the underlying ideology or the cause or the actual physical damage, it tacitly endorses the far right's claim of equivalence. The message is that the state sees protest, regardless of its motivation, only as a threat to order.
A threat that must be eliminated.
Yes.
But the laws being passed to fight this perceived public disorder, they're sold to the public as necessary measures for everyone's safety. How does this end up harming the communities it supposedly protects?
Well, expanded police powers are never applied uniformly or neutrally, despite the rhetoric. History shows us that when the state is granted new powers to fight generalized disorder, those powers are disproportionately and aggressively applied against communities already subject to systemic bias.
So we're talking about over-policed communities of color.
Specifically, yes. Over-policed communities of color, particularly Muslim communities, become subject to heightened surveillance, more invasive scrutiny, and more aggressive physical responses.
So in the name of enforcing a generalized standard of public order, the ultimate effect is to enforce ideological conformity. And that primarily benefits the ideological status quo, while further harming the very communities the law pretends to protect.
That's it, exactly. The expanded police state serves the interests of ideological conformity rather than acting as a neutral rule of law. The state wins expanded powers, often resulting in new legislation, while the communities already struggling with systemic bias are harmed even further.
And the idea that more policing and less tolerance means greater safety for everyone.
That belief is thoroughly rejected by the documented reality in these highly policed communities.
That brings us to the second sphere of control. If ideological conformity is enforced with physical power on the streets, the logic of that control has to extend into the digital sphere. It has to use legal and regulatory power. This is why we need to spend serious time on the European Union's Digital Services Act, or DSA. This is where the Laboratory for Thought Control gets its global blueprint. The EU is attempting to become the world's internet regulator.
It's the technocratic blueprint, precisely. The DSA, passed in 2022, is the EU's comprehensive digital censorship law. Now, its stated goal sounds benign, to ensure a safe digital environment, but its operational effect is profound.
And it targets the big players.
It mandates that very large online platforms, or VLOPs, must proactively identify and mitigate systemic risks across their platform.
We should define VLOPs, just for clarity. We're talking about the giants here, right?
Yes, VLOPs are defined by user count, generally any platform that reaches 45 million monthly active users in the EU. So this includes Google, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, or X.
The big ones.
They are the entities subject to the most severe regulation and scrutiny.
And what defines those systemic risks that the VLOPs are required to mitigate?
Well, the scope is extraordinarily broad and inherently subjective. It includes risks related to things like misleading or deceptive content and disinformation.
Words that are very hard to pin down.
Exactly. The law casts a net so wide it allows regulators enormous, potentially limitless discretion to demand platforms remove content based on what the regulators deem to be socially harmful, even if it is otherwise perfectly legal speech.
Okay, this is a European law. Why should a user or platform in the United States or anywhere else outside the EU worry about this? This is the core of the global threat.
This is the critical point. It's known as the Brussels effect. Compliance with the DSA fundamentally infringes on American free speech standards because large American tech companies, driven by efficiency, cannot afford to maintain 27 slightly different content moderation policies for each EU member state.
Plus another for the rest of the world.
Right. It's not feasible, so they inevitably apply a single, unified, conservative set of content moderation policies globally.
Conservative meaning cautious.
Cautious, yes. Risk-averse. So any changes driven by an EU mandate to censor certain types of content or apply new filters to mitigate risk can and will affect every user everywhere. It creates a de facto global censorship standard set by EU officials.
And the penalties for non-compliance are explicitly designed to ensure this global compliance, even if a company resists the ideological push.
They're designed to be dissuasive to the point of being a corporate existential threat. Failure to censor enough content or failure to satisfy European regulators carries severe penalties, up to 6% of a company's global revenue.
6% of global revenue. For a company like Google or Meta, that's a catastrophic fine.
It could wipe out a quarter's profits easily.
Yeah.
And the other threat is the power, during extraordinary circumstances, for regulators to temporarily shut down platforms within the EU entirely.
So the stakes are enormous.
The stakes ensure that platforms will comply, even if it means altering their global policies to align with European ideological preferences.
So given those stakes, how does the EU actually manage this censorship on a day-to-day basis without constantly issuing new mandates? You mentioned this is an infrastructure of censorship by proxy.
The most powerful operational tool they created is the trusted flaggers system. It's outlined in Article 22. This is the mechanism that essentially deputizes non-governmental organizations and certain academic groups.
Deputizes them.
Yes. Trusted flaggers are entities, often civil society organizations, think tanks, or specialized nonprofits, recognized by EU officials for their expertise in detecting illegal content or systemic risks.
And what power do these flaggers possess?
VLOPs must prioritize notifications from these flaggers and act on them without undue delay. This means a flagged piece of content jumps to the front of the queue, bypassing the normal content review process.
It's a fast lane for censorship.
A fast lane for censorship requests based on ideological expertise, not necessarily a legal ruling.
Now, I know the law states that these flaggers must be independent from the platforms themselves, but who are they independent from, really?
That's the crucial nuance that's often missed. They must be independent from the platforms to avoid conflicts of interest, but they are absolutely not required to be non-partial politically.
And many of them are.
Many are very closely aligned with or even financially incentivized by the regulatory bodies or political factions that wrote the DSA in the first place.
So we have organizations that are ideologically aligned with the regulators, possessing a fast-pass system to flag content globally, backed by the implicit threat of a massive global fine if the platforms don't act quickly enough. That changes the power dynamic from a regulatory requirement to an overwhelming coercive force.
Precisely. The system encourages these trusted flaggers to just overwhelm platforms with notices, creating a sort of regulatory pressure cooker. If a platform pushes back or moves too slowly, they're taking a huge regulatory risk.
It's all transparent to the regulators.
Yes, because the flaggers have to publish reports detailing their notifications and the platform's response, or lack thereof. So European regulators have total visibility into which platforms are cooperating. This coerces platforms into changing their global moderation policies to align with the flaggers' demands.
And this leads directly to the voluntary codes of conduct mentioned in Article 45. They sound voluntary, but nothing in this system suggests genuine choice.
The term voluntary is purely for political optics. Compliance with these codes, like the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which mandates using third-party fact-checkers who are often themselves ideologically aligned, serves as a crucial safe harbor against the most aggressive DSA enforcement.
So if you comply with the code, the regulators are less likely to hit you with that massive fine.
Exactly. And we know from non-public communications that European Commission regulators repeatedly and deliberately reached out to pressure reluctant companies to sign on to these codes. So for a company that wants to operate without perpetual regulatory interference, these voluntary codes become non-voluntary prerequisites for survival.
Let's turn to the actual content being targeted, because this is where the ideological focus of the law becomes glaringly obvious. We have some striking case studies where core political speech was censored, or attempts were made to censor it, purely based on viewpoint disagreement. Let's start with that Polish example about electric cars.
This case is remarkable because it involved a regulatory body attempting to enforce economic and industrial policy through censorship. The Polish National Research Institute requested that TikTok remove a post. The post stated clearly that electric cars are neither an ecological nor an economical solution.
That is protected political speech in almost any Western democracy. It's a challenge to public policy on a massive industrial shift, often driven by government subsidies.
Absolutely. The post contained a viewpoint that just disagreed with the prevailing political push for electric cars. The regulator's motivation was clearly not hate speech or inciting violence. The objection was fundamental disagreement with the political viewpoint. It shows regulators weaponizing the DSA to attack political speech they simply disagree with.
And next, we see the DSA framework used to silence debate on mass migration in both France and Germany, moving into even more politically charged territory.
Yes, we see clear examples of national regulators trying to enforce a particular narrative on immigration. In France, following a high-profile, brutal knife attack in Annecy, where a Syrian refugee stabbed several young children,
Horrific incident.
French authorities attempted to use the DSA framework to target a U.S.-based account's satirical post regarding immigration and citizenship policy.
And that post was part of a huge, necessary public debate on the effects of migration policy after a traumatic event.
Precisely. Yet, French regulators sought to censor that viewpoint, to remove it entirely from the digital public square rather than allowing it to be debated. They wanted to control the public dialogue.
And the German example is even more explicit about the legal categories being used to silence disagreement.
The German authorities classified a direct call for the deportation of criminal aliens. The precise phrase was, "deport the whole lot of them," as incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, and an attack on human dignity.
And this was in response to a specific news story.
Yes, it was in response to a news article detailing a specific Syrian family that had reportedly committed 110 criminal offenses. The regulators targeted political speech on a major public debate topic, implying the platform needed to remove the post entirely.
The pattern is clear. If the speech challenges core government or EU policy, whether it's on energy, migration, or social issues, it runs the risk of being labeled a systemic risk that must be mitigated.
And this is where it really strikes home for anyone who believes in robust political debate, particularly in the U.S. context. The DSA is targeting common American political idioms and even humor.
How far does this targeting go? What kind of common phrases are we talking about?
Well, the European Commission's own internal regulatory exercises reveal they are defining certain phrases as coded language or potentially illegal hate speech, a phrase that is used constantly across the American political spectrum by figures from progressives like Kamala Harris to conservatives like Donald Trump is, "We need to take back our country."
Wait, that phrase is a standard political idiom. It's used by anyone signaling dissatisfaction with the current direction of the status quo, regardless of which side they're on.
Of course. But the Commission's exercise categorized comments like this as coded language and potentially illegal hate speech that platforms should scrutinize and remove. The idea that this is considered a threat that requires mandatory global censorship is staggering.
In a regime that demands ideological conformity, any phrase signaling a fundamental rejection of the status quo could be seen as a threat.
Exactly. In Europe, simply posting that phrase may be deemed illegal speech, and platforms are mandated to censor it to avoid those 6% global revenue fines.
Furthermore, the DSA seems specifically concerned with the most effective forms of political dissent, like humor and satire.
That is a critical signal about the underlying ideological paranoia. One internal workshop question from the European Commission specifically asks how content moderation processes can address memes that may be used to spread hate speech.
So they're targeting memes.
They're targeting the tools of dissent. Satire and parody are potent precisely because they compellingly highlight government excess, overreach, or absurdity. An authority that believes it has a monopoly on truth sees humor that questions its legitimacy as a systemic risk that needs mitigation and removal. You cannot satirize the system if the system forbids dissent.
And the ideological targeting extends right down to the hypothetical users in their training exercises.
Yes, this speaks volumes about the ideological lens being applied. Internal commission exercises reveal a scenario where the primary perpetrator of hate speech is a fictional, stereotypical conservative account with the handle @Patriot90.
And Patriot90.
That was the only scenario among the 8 provided where a fake account name was presented, and it was used to illustrate a specific type of ideological violation. The suggestion is clear. Accounts indicating a conservative political affiliation or national pride are being singled out as ideological threats in their regulatory training.
This blueprint for thought control, where an expert consensus aligned with regulators defines political dissent and labels it a systemic risk, is fundamentally altering the structure of global free speech.
And we have to remember the immense power dynamic at play. Now, in some of the examples we cited, the platforms initially refused to censor the political speech outside of the requesting country. But the punitive structure of the DSA, with its fines of up to 6% of global revenue, creates an environment where global policy changes become inevitable.
It's a law drafted in Europe, but its function is to impose paternalistic restrictions on online speech everywhere that touches these major platforms.
It's the ultimate regulatory weapon, moving the power of the state from the voting booth and the courts into the hands of technocrats and ideologically aligned NGOs.
Okay, so if the street level is controlled by two-tier policing, which manages physical ideological narratives, and the digital sphere is controlled by the DSA. Then the final defense, or perhaps the ultimate weapon, is the legal backstop provided by the European Union itself.
Right.
This focuses on its founding values, things like the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights, which are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union.
That's the apex of the system. The EU found itself in an existential crisis because these founding values were in persistent disregard in member states like Hungary and Poland, where systemic attacks on judicial independence and civil society were occurring.
And the traditional mechanisms they had to enforce these values, they just failed. What were those traditional tools?
The initial mechanism was the political process under Article 7 of the TEU. It allowed the EU to sanction a member state for a serious and persistent breach of values. But this mechanism failed.
Why did it fail?
Because it required political unanimity among the other member states to trigger the most severe sanctions, and political alliances just blocked that consensus.
So the political route was a dead end. That left the legal route. Ordinary infringement actions. Why did those fail?
Ordinary infringement actions, under Articles 258 and 259, are legal challenges brought by the European Commission against a member state for violating a specific EU law. The reason they failed in this context is that they are too narrow. They can only challenge a single specific violation of the existing body of EU law, which is known as the acquis.
So the result was this pattern described as losing through winning. The EU would win a small legal point, but lose the overall battle.
Exactly. The Commission might win a minor technical legal case related to, say, age discrimination, which is an established part of the acquis, but it failed entirely to halt the systemic constitutional dismantling that was the actual political goal of the offending member state.
They were winning battles while losing the war.
The war for the integrity of their own founding values, yes.
This inability to fight a systemic attack with these narrow technical tools led to a radical proposal to retool the existing legal system to defend itself. This is what proponents call adopting the tools of a militant democracy.
Yes. The institutional and academic push is to adapt those existing infringement provisions, Articles 258 through 260, into what are now called systemic infringement procedures. They aren't proposing a new law, but a massive new application of old procedures.
And the focus shifts.
It moves the focus from enforcing the narrow acquis to ensuring respect for the broader foundational values of the Union.
So, if the old system focused on symptoms, how does this novel approach of a systemic infringement procedure target the disease, the underlying political intent?
The key mechanism is bundling. Instead of tackling one problem at a time, one law on NGOs, one on judges, one on media, the Commission or a group of member states would bundle a collection of individual violations, even if they came from radically different legal fields.
And the goal of that bundling?
The goal is to prove a persistent and coherent pattern of unlawful activity that, when you view it holistically, proves a systemic violation of the core values of Article 2, particularly the rule of law.
It's the difference between prosecuting a single car theft and prosecuting a persistent, organized criminal conspiracy where the individual crimes are just evidence of the larger structure.
That's a perfect way to put it. A narrow action addresses the symptom, but a systemic action targets the underlying politically motivated strategy. And this concept of bundling, while new for rule of law violations, has been affirmed by the European Court of Justice in other fields.
Right. Let's look at an analogy where this worked in a non-values context to understand the legal doctrine.
Consider the environmental cases. The Commission successfully used bundling against countries like Ireland and Italy to prove a failure of enforcement. Against Ireland, they gathered evidence of 12 different waste disposal sites operating in flagrant violation of the Waste Directive. The court agreed that 12 scattered sites didn't just indicate 12 isolated problems. They indicated a general lack of enforcement and a large-scale administrative problem.
A systemic failure.
And against Italy, the case was even more massive, documenting 4,866 illegal pits nationwide. The court found that this massive, consistent pattern proved the government had generally and persistently failed to fulfill its obligations. The consistency and sheer number proved a pattern of systemic failure. That is the exact doctrinal strategy proposed for challenging rule of law destruction.
This ability to bundle becomes essential when you look at the failure in Hungary. Let's detail the Hungary fiasco again, contrasting the legal victory with the systemic failure.
The case of the Hungarian judiciary is the textbook illustration of losing through winning. Hungary lowered the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62. This was a move designed to replace hundreds of senior judges with politically compliant allies, a fundamental threat to judicial independence.
And the European Commission, using its narrow toolbox,
focused its infringement action narrowly on age discrimination, a violation of the established acquis.
They won on the technical legal point of age discrimination.
They did. But from the point of view of restoring judicial independence and protecting the values of Article 2, the legal victory achieved nothing. The Hungarian government simply replaced the purged judges through other legally permissible means. The systemic, politically motivated problem of judicial capture remained entirely at a dust.
And we see the same piecemeal failure in the assault on civil society organizations, the NGOs linked to George Soros.
Exactly. Hungary implemented a coordinated political attack using multiple legislative actions. The Lex CEU law, targeting Central European University, a separate law requiring NGOs receiving foreign funding to register as foreign agents, and a third law imposing a 25% tax on donations supporting migration.
And the Commission treated these as three separate, narrow legal problems.
Instead of seeing them as a single coordinated assault on democratic opposition, the outcome was that while the Commission slowly challenged some of these laws, the affected organizations, like CEU, were forced to leave the country before the legal cases were even resolved. The systemic assault on human rights was never challenged as a coherent, values-based violation.
And critically, this narrow, symptom-focused approach meant the Commission often avoided challenging the most devastating political actions of all.
That's the uncovered abyss. The most critical component of rule of law destruction, the political capture of the constitutional tribunals in both Poland and Hungary, was often ignored by the Commission.
Why?
Because these actions didn't neatly fall under a safe or clearly established existing legal provision of the acquis, they couldn't be easily categorized as age discrimination or environmental failure. The ECJ had made progress using Article 19.1 of the TEU, which concerns judicial independence as a kind of safe harbor. But Article 19.1 only covered the independence of judges who might refer cases to the EU courts. It couldn't reach sustained attacks on prosecutors or the political capture of bodies like the Constitutional Tribunal, which holds the government accountable domestically.
So there was an abyss.
An abyss between those elements of Article 2 TEU values that could be brought within the ambit of Article 19.1 TEU and all the other values.
The new proposal, the systemic infringement procedure, is designed to leap across that abyss. What's the end goal of a finding of systemic violation?
The goal is to compel not just minor legal tweaks, but systemic compliance. A finding of systemic violation means the member state must perform a root and branch change to restore affected constitutional structures. It demands political will to undo the damage, not just pay a fine.
And that requires a serious motivator. This is where the proposals tie into the ultimate political leverage point. The financial weapon.
This is where the legal concept gets teeth and becomes highly political. If a member state fails to restore compliance following a systemic violation finding, the proposal leverages Article 260 TFEU, which traditionally governs fixed fines for noncompliance, to allow for the suspension of EU funds as a fine.
So it's not just a fine that gets paid sometime next year. It's an immediate withholding of expected funding.
It is the ultimate pressure point, the real coercive mechanism. Research suggests that politicians and the public feel the loss of expected budgeted funds far more acutely than a distant, abstract fine. Withholding anticipated EU funding, which can be a massive portion of a country's budget, is felt immediately, forcing systemic change.
And the rationale for linking values compliance to funding is not merely punitive, is it?
No, it's also pragmatic. The rationale is twofold. First, it's a powerful motivator, and second, it addresses the moral hazard of the previous system. Why should the EU continue to subsidize a member state which flaunts the EU's basic values?
It stops them from financing their own destruction.
Exactly. This systemic legal tool is the ultimate enforcement mechanism, allowing the central authority to define and compel conformity to a singular set of political values, backed by massive financial leverage.
It creates a new level of supranational enforcement, asserting that the political character of a member state is no longer a purely sovereign matter, but a prerequisite for receiving the benefits of membership.
When we synthesize these three operational spheres, the street, the digital realm, and the institutional backstop, we see a clear, powerful, and converging pattern. All these mechanisms are fundamentally focused on enforcing ideological uniformity in Europe.
It's all about compliance.
They create a system where compliance with the ideological orthodoxies of the state is not assumed, but actively and aggressively policed.
It's a comprehensive architecture for authority that is moving beyond protecting inherent rights to actively managing conditional privileges. On the street, the mechanism of two-tier policing shifts the perception of victimhood away from marginalized communities, even as expanded powers continue to disproportionately harm them in the name of order. And digitally, the DSA establishes a system of technocratic censorship by proxy, using the threat of massive financial ruin on a global scale to ensure conformity, targeting political dissent, and even humor that questions authority.
And at the highest legal level, the discussion about systemic infringement procedures is about creating a legal architecture, a militant democracy, that can centrally define and enforce compliance with a specific political interpretation of values. This is achieved through the ultimate financial coercion to effect fundamental constitutional changes in sovereign member states.
The systems we discussed, policing based on ideological acceptance, a global digital law that targets satire and commonplace political dissent, and legal procedures designed to enforce a single, non-negotiable definition of values, are all symptoms of an authority that believes it has a monopoly on truth. The tragic irony of this soft totalitarianism is that while the promise of a free society is the freedom to debate, to dissent, and ultimately to be wrong publicly, the new legal and social architecture across Europe seems designed precisely to eliminate that freedom in favor of enforced conformity. We must closely assess how these blueprints for centralized ideological control might impact our own constitutional protections now and in the future.